Breaking news coming in. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking right now after the U.S. slapped Canada with 25% tariffs. Let's listen.
So today, the United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator.
Tensions between the United States and Canada have been steadily rising, evolving into a serious trade dispute that has caught the attention of businesses, policymakers, and financial markets on both sides of the border. This conflict has been driven by a series of escalating measures, with each country imposing tariffs and countermeasures in response to the other's actions. The economic impact of these decisions has been felt across multiple industries, affecting everything from manufacturing to consumer prices. At the heart of this conflict is a long-standing trade relationship that has been a cornerstone of both economies. The United States and Canada share one of the largest bilateral trade partnerships in the world, with goods and services worth hundreds of billions of dollars exchanged annually. This relationship has historically been beneficial for both nations, fostering economic growth and job creation. However, when political decisions begin to shape trade policies, the consequences can be far-reaching. The situation took a sharp turn when the U.S. government, under President Donald Trump, imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum imports. This decision was justified on the grounds of national security, a claim that has been widely debated among economic experts and trade analysts. While the administration argued that protecting domestic industries was necessary to safeguard American jobs, critics viewed the move as an unnecessary strain on a key trading relationship. Many pointed out that Canada had long been a reliable supplier of these materials, and there was little evidence to suggest that its exports posed a threat to U.S. security. Canada responded to these tariffs with its own set of economic measures. Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, took the lead by introducing a 25% surcharge on electricity exported to the United States. The surcharge was specifically targeted at states like Minnesota, Michigan, and New York, regions that rely on Canadian electricity to meet their energy needs. By increasing energy costs in these areas, Ford's administration aimed to pressure U.S. policymakers into reconsidering the tariffs on steel and aluminum. This move was seen as a direct retaliation, and it quickly sparked further discussions about the potential consequences of a prolonged trade dispute. Energy analysts noted that the surcharge could lead to an increase of up to $100 in the average household's monthly electricity bill in the affected states. Additionally, some estimates suggested that the policy could drain nearly $400,000 per day from each state's economy, making it a significant financial burden for local businesses and consumers alike. While Canada's response was a calculated attempt to push back against U.S. trade policies, the move also carried risks. Increasing the cost of electricity for American consumers had the potential to sour public opinion toward Canadian exports, which could have long-term consequences for cross-border energy trade. There were also concerns that the move might escalate tensions rather than encourage negotiation, potentially leading to further trade restrictions. The U.S. government did not back down in the face of Canada's countermeasures. Instead, President Trump announced that tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum would not only remain in place, but would be doubled to 50%. This decision sent shockwaves through the business world, raising fears that the dispute could spiral into a full-blown trade war. Many industries that rely on steel and aluminum, including automotive manufacturing and construction, began to brace for higher costs and potential supply chain disruptions. The financial markets reacted swiftly to the developments. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, one of the main indicators of economic confidence in the United States, tumbled nearly 600 points following the announcement. Although it managed to recover slightly, it still closed down 478 points, a drop of approximately 1.1%. This decline came on the heels of another major loss of 900 points the previous day, highlighting the growing uncertainty among investors. The broader S&P 500 index also declined by 0.7%, while the tech-heavy Nasdaq Composite slipped by 0.2%, reflecting a general sense of unease about the economic outlook. Market analysts pointed out that investors were particularly concerned about the potential for a prolonged trade dispute to trigger a recession. Trade tensions can have a ripple effect on various sectors of the economy, increasing costs for businesses, reducing consumer confidence, and slowing down investment. If key industries such as automotive manufacturing and infrastructure infrastructure development were to be affected by higher raw material costs. It could lead to job losses and a slowdown in economic activity. Beyond the immediate financial consequences, there were also concerns about the broader implications of the escalating trade conflict. The United States and Canada have long been close economic allies, and their integrated supply chains mean that disruptions in one country can quickly affect businesses in the other. Many American companies rely on Canadian steel and aluminum to produce goods that are then sold domestically or exported to other markets. Similarly, Canadian manufacturers depend on American components and machinery to keep their operations running smoothly. Trade experts warned that if the dispute continued to escalate, it could lead to significant disruptions in North American manufacturing. This was particularly concerning for industries that operate on just-in-time supply chains, where materials are delivered as needed to minimize storage costs. Any delays or increases in costs could have a cascading effect, reducing profitability and potentially leading to job cuts. The situation also had political ramifications. In Canada, the federal government faced mounting pressure to respond forcefully to the U.S. tariffs, while also ensuring that the economic impact on Canadian businesses and consumers was minimized. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his administration sought to strike a balance between standing firm against U.S. trade policies and keeping the door open for negotiations. The challenge was to send a clear message that Canada would not be pushed around while also avoiding measures that could further harm economic relations. Meanwhile, in the United States, the tariffs were a divisive issue. While some political leaders supported the measures as a way to protect American industries, others expressed concern that the tariffs could end up doing more harm than good. Many lawmakers from states that rely on trade with Canada, including those in the Midwest and Northeast, called for a more measured approach. They warned that escalating the dispute could hurt American businesses and consumers, particularly those in industries that depend on Canadian imports. Despite the uncertainty, both countries recognized the importance of maintaining a stable economic relationship. Trade between the U.S. and Canada is not only a matter of national policy, but also a crucial aspect of everyday life for millions of people. Businesses on both sides of the border rely on open markets to sustain jobs and economic growth, and disruptions to trade can have real-world consequences for workers and consumers alike. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford played a central role in Canada's response to the U.S. tariffs. Initially, he had introduced a 25% surcharge on electricity exported to the United States, directly targeting states like Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. These states rely on Canadian electricity to supplement their power supply, and the surcharge was intended to apply economic pressure by increasing their energy costs. Analysts estimated that this policy could add an extra $100 to the average household's monthly bill in those regions. Additionally, businesses faced increased operational costs, and state economies risked losing nearly $400,000 per day due to the additional financial burden. Ford's electricity surcharge was seen as a calculated move to retaliate against President Trump's 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. However, as tensions escalated, concerns grew over the long-term economic consequences. Many experts feared that rather than forcing the U.S. to reconsider its trade policies, such measures might push the dispute further into a prolonged economic standoff. Business leaders from both countries voiced concerns that continued tit-for-tat retaliation would only make the situation worse. Recognizing the risk of further escalation, Ford agreed to meet with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in a high-stakes diplomatic discussion. The meeting aimed to explore possible solutions to cool down the growing trade conflict before it spiraled out of control. Both sides acknowledged the importance of trade between the two nations and the need to maintain a stable economic relationship. While tensions remained high, the talks were described as productive, with both parties expressing a willingness to find a middle ground. Following this meeting, Ford made a surprising decision. He announced that Ontario would suspend the electricity surcharge that had been imposed on U.S. states. This move was not just about reducing costs for American consumers. It was a clear signal that Canada was willing to take steps toward easing tensions and returning to the negotiating table. The decision was met with mixed reactions. While some viewed it as a strategic de-escalation, others feared that backing down without securing a U.S. concession could weaken Canada's position. The move had an immediate effect. President Trump, who had just announced plans to double tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel from 25% to 50%, unexpectedly changed course. Instead of moving forward with the tariff increase, he decided to leave them at the original 25%. This sudden shift indicated that trade policies were heavily influenced by political and economic considerations, and that both countries were carefully calculating their next moves. While Canada's willingness to suspend the electricity surcharge may have helped prevent further escalation, it did not bring an end to the dispute. Despite this brief pause in escalation, Canada was not prepared to sit idly by while U.S. tariffs remained in place. In response to the American trade measures, the Canadian government imposed its own set of counter-tariffs. These targeted approximately $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, effectively matching the 25% tariff imposed on Canadian metals. The list of affected products was extensive, covering steel, aluminum, electronics, sports equipment, and even cast iron products. The goal was to apply economic pressure on U.S. industries that relied on exports to Canada, sending a clear message that trade restrictions would come with consequences. The decision to impose retaliatory tariffs was not taken lightly. Canada and the U.S. have one of the most deeply integrated economic relationships in the world, with trade amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Disrupting this flow of goods risked damaging both economies, but Canadian officials argued that failing to respond forcefully would leave them vulnerable to further aggressive trade policies from the U.S. The hope was that by imposing counter-tariffs, Canada could push the U.S. to reconsider its stance and negotiate a more favorable agreement. Amid these ongoing trade tensions, Canada's incoming Prime Minister Mark Carney made his position clear. Carney, who was preparing to take office, emphasized that he was open to negotiating with the United States, but not at any cost. In a public statement, he declared, "I am willing to meet with President Trump, but only if Canada's sovereignty is fully respected. Any agreement we make must benefit both nations." His words signaled a firm but measured approach, reinforcing the idea that Canada was willing to engage in discussions but would not accept unfavorable terms. Carney's emphasis on sovereignty came at a critical moment. Just as negotiations seemed to be moving toward a more constructive direction, President Trump made a proposal that caught everyone off guard. Speaking at a press event, he suggested, "The simplest solution is for Canada to become our beloved 51st state. That way, all these tariff battles would disappear overnight." While Trump's remark may have been intended as a bold statement rather than a serious policy proposal, it immediately sparked a strong reaction from Canadian leaders and the public. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded swiftly and decisively. In a firm statement, he said, "There isn't a snowball's chance in hell that Canada would ever become part of the United States." Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre echoed this sentiment, declaring, "Canada will never be the 51st state. We are, and always will be, a strong, independent, and sovereign nation." The rejection of the idea was not limited to politicians. Polling data revealed that an overwhelming 90% of Canadians opposed the notion of annexation, making it clear that the proposal was not up for debate. The reaction to Trump's proposal led to a surge of patriotism across Canada. Citizens and political leaders alike doubled down on their national identity, reinforcing the importance of maintaining independence in trade policies and governance. Canadian flags were seen flying high across the country, and discussions about economic sovereignty became more prominent in both political and public discourse. The suggestion of annexation, whether made in jest or not, only served to strengthen Canada's resolve in the ongoing trade dispute. While the focus remained on trade, Canada's response was also about asserting its position on the global stage. The country had spent decades cultivating a reputation as a strong and independent nation with a robust economy. Being treated as a subordinate trade partner or a potential U.S. territory was not an acceptable outcome. Canadian officials continued to push for negotiations that would allow both countries to benefit from trade while respecting national sovereignty. One of the most significant areas of focus was Canada's energy and natural resources sector, particularly in British Columbia. The province plays a crucial role in the North American coal trade, serving as a major export gateway for both Canadian and American coal. However, as trade tensions mounted, British Columbia took steps to disrupt the flow of U.S. coal through its ports. Premier David Eby called for the introduction of new taxes on American thermal coal. a move aimed at challenging U.S. reliance on Canadian infrastructure to export coal to international markets. For years, environmental groups and policymakers in British Columbia had raised concerns about the environmental and economic implications of handling U.S. coal. Many American coal companies use Canadian ports, particularly in Vancouver, because they face restrictions on building coal export terminals along the west coast of the United States. This arrangement has allowed U.S. coal producers to maintain a strong presence in global markets while avoiding domestic regulatory hurdles. However, with trade tensions escalating, British Columbia saw an opportunity to reassess these policies and push back against U.S. trade measures. The impact of such restrictions on U.S. coal exports could be significant. In 2023 alone, the Port of Vancouver processed approximately 17.6 million metric tons of thermal coal, with nearly two-thirds of that coal, about 11.7 million metric tons, originating from the United States. Most of this coal came from Montana and Wyoming, particularly from the Powder River Basin, one of the largest coal-producing regions in the world. If British Columbia imposed new taxes or restrictions on U.S. coal shipments, American producers would face major logistical challenges in getting their product to international markets. Beyond the environmental concerns, the economic implications of limiting U.S. coal exports through Canadian ports were substantial. If British Columbia followed through with its proposed restrictions, American coal companies would have to seek alternative routes, which would likely be more expensive and less efficient. With limited port access on the U.S. West Coast, companies might be forced to transport coal longer distances to reach ports in the Gulf of Mexico or the East Coast, driving up transportation costs and reducing profit margins. Meanwhile, other provinces implemented their own countermeasures in response to U.S. tariffs. Ontario and Quebec took a direct approach by targeting American alcohol imports. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario, LCBO, and the Société des Alcools du Québec, SAQ, which control liquor sales in their respective provinces, announced that they would stop purchasing American spirits. This decision dealt a significant blow to U.S. distillers, who rely on Canadian markets for a substantial portion of their exports. By removing American-made alcohol from store shelves, Ontario and Quebec signaled their willingness to extend the trade dispute into the consumer goods sector. Nova Scotia also joined in with measures aimed at hitting American businesses and travelers. Premier Tim Houston doubled highway tolls for U.S. vehicles passing through the province, making it more expensive for American tourists and truckers to travel in the region. At the same time, the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation followed Ontario and Quebec's lead, pulling American alcohol from its shelves. The move sent a clear message that Canadian provinces were willing to take aggressive action to defend their economic interests. In the Prairie provinces, responses to the trade conflict were initially more cautious. Alberta, a province with deep economic ties to the United States, hesitated to take immediate action. However, as the dispute dragged on, Premier Danielle Smith shifted gears and backed a plan to introduce tariffs on American products that could just as easily be sourced from Canada or other international suppliers. Rather than implementing quick, reactionary policies, Alberta took a long-term approach, focusing on building new supply chains to reduce dependence on U.S. imports altogether. British Columbia, in addition to its focus on coal exports, took a more targeted approach by introducing trade restrictions based on political alignment. Premier David Eby announced that the province's liquor distribution branch would stop purchasing alcohol from Republican-led U.S. states. The decision was designed to send a political message without completely disrupting British Columbia's broader trade ties with the United States. By targeting specific states rather than implementing a blanket ban, British Columbia aimed to highlight its opposition to certain U.S. policies while maintaining key trade relationships. Out on the East Coast, other provinces introduced their own measures to push back against U.S. trade policies. Nova Scotia was not the only province to impose highway toll increases. Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick also explored similar measures to increase costs for American travelers. While these actions were largely symbolic, they reflected the growing frustration among Canadian provinces over the economic impact of the trade dispute. Manitoba and Prince Edward Island took even bolder steps, outright banning American liquor imports. Premiers Wab Kinew and Dennis King argued that local businesses should not have to bear the brunt of an unfair trade war. Their message was simple: Canada's economy comes first. These policies were designed to encourage consumers to support local products while simultaneously applying pressure on American exporters. In the Northern Territories, Yukon also joined the effort to reduce reliance on American goods. Premier Ranj Pillai halted all U.S. alcohol imports and began reviewing government contracts with American companies. Yukon officials even floated the idea of imposing tolls on U.S. vehicles traveling through the territory, though that plan was temporarily put on hold as negotiations with the federal government continued. As these provincial countermeasures were implemented, the economic effects began to take shape. While U.S. businesses faced new barriers to trade, Canadian industries also had to adapt to the changing landscape. The removal of American goods from Canadian markets meant that domestic producers had an opportunity to fill the gap, but it also raised concerns about supply chain disruptions and increased costs for consumers. The trade conflict also had broader implications for North American energy markets. While British Columbia's proposed restrictions on U.S. coal exports were one example, Canada's response to U.S. tariffs extended to other key industries. Ontario and Quebec's decisions to target American liquor imports highlighted the extent to which provinces were willing to take action, even if it meant temporary economic disruptions. Despite the growing number of retaliatory measures, Canadian officials remained open to negotiations. The hope was that by demonstrating their willingness to take strong economic action, they could push the U.S. toward a more favorable trade agreement. However, as both sides continued to introduce new policies, the question remained whether these efforts would lead to a resolution or further escalate the dispute. One of the most heavily impacted sectors was the North American automotive industry. Canadian steel and aluminum are critical materials for U.S. car manufacturers, and the introduction of tariffs led to a significant increase in production costs. Companies like Ford and General Motors, which rely on these metals to produce vehicles, found themselves grappling with higher expenses. Analysts estimated that the tariffs could add as much as $400 to the production cost of a Ford F-150, one of the best-selling trucks in North America. This placed automakers in a difficult position, forcing them to either absorb the added costs or pass them on to consumers through higher vehicle prices. Beyond the automotive industry, consumer goods also felt the strain of rising trade tensions. Electronics, home appliances, and sports equipment, all products that frequently cross the U.S.-Canada border, became more expensive due to increased import duties. Retailers, already facing competition from e-commerce and shifting consumer habits, had to make tough decisions about pricing and inventory management. Some companies opted to absorb the tariff costs to maintain customer loyalty, while others raised prices, leading to concerns about inflationary pressure. The effects of the trade dispute extended to supply chains, as businesses struggled to adjust to the new economic landscape. Many manufacturers operate on just-in-time production models, meaning they rely on precise deliveries of materials and components to keep their operations running smoothly. With tariffs disrupting this flow, companies faced unexpected delays and higher costs. Some businesses began exploring alternative suppliers outside of North America, while others considered reshoring production to avoid the unpredictability of international trade policies. Financial markets also reflected the growing uncertainty. The stock market, which had already experienced volatility due to the escalating trade conflict, saw further fluctuations as investors assessed the long-term implications. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, S&P 500, and NASDAQ Composite all experienced periods of decline, reflecting investor concerns about the potential for a prolonged economic downturn. While markets showed resilience in some areas, the overall sentiment remained cautious. Meanwhile, another industry braced for impact: U.S. coal production. With British Columbia imposing new restrictions on American thermal coal exports, mining companies in states like Montana and Wyoming faced major logistical challenges. The province's ports had long been a key gateway for U.S. coal shipments to Asia, but new policies threatened to disrupt this supply chain. Without access to Canadian export facilities, U.S. coal producers had to explore more costly alternatives, further straining their already struggling industry. The cumulative effect of these economic pressures led to increased discussions about whether a resolution could be reached. Both countries had taken strong positions, with the U.S. government arguing that tariffs were necessary to protect domestic industries and Canada asserting its right to retaliate against what it viewed as unfair trade practices. However, businesses, workers, and consumers on both sides of the border were growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. In response to mounting concerns, Canadian officials continued to push for negotiations that would address trade imbalances while preserving the country's economic independence. Prime Minister Mark Carney reiterated that Canada was open to discussions, but would not accept a deal that compromised its sovereignty. His administration emphasized the need for a balanced agreement that would allow both nations to benefit from open trade without resorting to protectionist measures. Despite these efforts, tensions remained high. Just as it seemed that diplomatic progress might be made, political developments in the U.S. added another layer of complexity to the situation. With a presidential election on the horizon, trade policy became a central issue, with different factions advocating for either a tougher stance on international trade or a return to more cooperative economic policies. This uncertainty made it difficult for businesses to plan for the future, as they did not know whether the current tariffs would remain in place or be lifted under a new administration. For Canada, the trade dispute served as a wake-up call about the risks of over-reliance on the U.S. market. While the two countries have historically been close trading partners, the conflict underscored the importance of diversifying trade relationships. Canadian businesses began looking to other international markets, strengthening ties with the European Union, Asia, and Latin America to reduce dependence on U.S. imports and exports. As the trade war unfolded, both governments faced a critical choice: continue down the path of economic retaliation or seek a compromise that would restore stability. The longer the dispute continued, the greater the risk of long-term damage to industries and jobs on both sides of the border. With businesses and consumers feeling the impact, the pressure to find a resolution grew stronger. The future of U.S.-Canada trade relations remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the economic interconnectedness of the two nations made prolonged conflict unsustainable. While national policies and political agendas played a role in shaping trade decisions, the real effects were felt by the people and businesses that relied on a stable and predictable trade environment. Whether through diplomatic negotiations or shifts in economic policy, both countries would need to find a way forward that balanced their interests while ensuring the long-term prosperity of their economies.